Okay, we're back. It's another episode of Pillow Talk Radio. And before we dive into today's episode, which is such a podcast host thing to say, I want to let you all know that my signature group program, Magnetics Love School, is officially open for enrollment for the August cohort. This is my 90-day accelerator for romantic skills and magnetism, which is just as juicy as it sounds. It's a really unique, immersive experience that I put together for a hand-selected group of people, and I really pour my heart into this, and it's really special. So the next round is for all women. I'm so excited to bring the insight that I have gleaned from coaching men. I want to bring that understanding to women. So that's what I'm going to do, because as you're going to learn, I just follow the internal pulls. That's what's happening. If you're interested to learn more about that, go to coraboydcoaching.com/magnetics and submit an application, and my team will chat with you in the next few weeks. As a primer for today's episode, I do want to extend a trigger warning. This is a conversation my friend Kate and I recorded about 2 months ago. The subject matter is sexual trauma and assault, why it's so hard to talk about, and also we provide and kind of brainstorm some best practices and tools for navigating conversation around this. So I hope that this episode is impactful and helpful, and just know that there are parts of it that get kind of heavy. I believe I shed a couple tears. So without further ado, we'll dive in. And P.S., at the end of the episode, I share some stats around how Black women disproportionately experience sexual trauma and sexual assault. So listen through to the end. I'm going to read a post that Kate made on Instagram sharing some stats, because as you'll find out in just one moment, Kate is a major data nerd. Without further ado, Catherine MacDermott. Relax. Close your eyes. Take a deep breath. Welcome to Pillow Talk Radio, the most delicious place to be. On this podcast, we explore how to create more connection, possibility, romance, and magic in love and in life. I'm your host and relationship specialist, Cora Boyd. Are you with me? We are here. I'm so excited. My friend Kate MacDermott, Catherine MacDermott, is in the house, and we're going to have a conversation about sexual assault and about why it's so hard to have conversations about sexual assault. So we're going to get kind of meta. So Kate is one of my best friends, and she lives in Brooklyn. She works in the tech industry as a product manager. So I feel like anytime I call you, I'm like, what have you been up to? And you're like, I've been solving the deep problems of the world. And then I'm like, sick. I just like yo-yoed off a chihuahua.
Usually there's a trampoline involved for you.
Usually there's a trampoline. Exactly. So Kate, in addition to doing that, and I think that that's important to mention, both because you're a woman in tech and you've had a lot of experiences as a woman in tech they're relevant to talk about, and also because it shows a little bit about how your brain works, and you're very data driven. You're very Kate is very thorough in her thinking and her problem solving, and you notice everything.
I do.
And I think you're going to see that, listeners are going to see that reflected in how thoroughly and thoughtfully you have put your energy towards addressing this problem of how the fuck are we supposed to do anything to alleviate sexual assault, both in terms of it happening more and in terms of the many, many, many people who have experienced it. So much of it is it's so shrouded in secrecy because it's so difficult to talk about. Kate also has a project called Revenance that I'm going to let her tell everyone about. So tell us a little bit about Revenance. What is the definition of the word revenance? What is, I've been waiting to say this. what was the genesis of Revenants and what was the purpose? Like, why did you create this and what does it look like? What is it?
So Revenants, I founded with one of my best friends, Carlisle, back in 2018. She and I had worked together at the time. And, it started because she and I went for a long walk one day. We had like a lot of pent up energy and kind of frustrations about certain things. So we just like went for a 2-hour walk during the workday and just like chatted. And it led to a lot of realizing that we have a lot of shared frustrations with the state of sexual assault in our society, whether it is certain dimensions of being a woman in tech, experiences that we were having in dating, which led us to just find, we had a lot of shared kind of experiences and interests and a really strong passion to change the way our society addresses this. And as you mentioned, Cora, like that's such a large problem to tackle. So it was really kind of like, how can we bring our skill sets to start working on this? So it really started as, me with my like heavy data focus. Carlisle is, leads a UX team and is like very, very creative in her brain and work. And so we kind of brought that together to figure out how can we bring people together in like a safe and inclusive space to have this conversation while also like being able to collect more kind of realistic data, because I think a lot of the data today is difficult and I think difficult to collect. And it's because so many people that have experienced this, don't really have a way to report it or kind of talk about it. So we wanted to figure out a better way to kind of get that information and start those conversations. The name of it came from, this was entirely Carlisle, but the word revenant means a person who has returned, especially supposedly from the dead. So,
so good. It's so witchy.
It's such this like helping people to reflect on their experiences, to learn and grow from them, and then just to continue to evolve as human beings, being better both for ourselves, for our friends, our partners, and our community, I think is like really the goal of it, to get us all to a better place of understanding and know like how we need to be talking about it and addressing it going forward.
Yeah, awesome. And as both of us have said, part of why it's so hard to collect data around is it's because it's like, what are we measuring? It's very difficult to define. And we're going to talk about that in a minute, like definitions around it, right? And also it's so sexual transgressions can be so nuanced. There are so many different ways that can happen. I think a lot of people downplay experiences that they may have had because it doesn't necessarily fit into this definition of forceful violence. It may be more coercive. It may be more, alcohol was involved. There's so many things that happen. And also, could you tell us a bit about the current stats, understanding that in terms of like stats around this, there's a whole enormous margin for error here.
Yes. Yeah. So some of the top stats, nearly 1 in 5 women has experienced either attempted or completed rape in her lifetime.
Mm-hmm. And when we're saying rape, that's defined within the more kind of like violent, forceful understanding. Exactly. Yes.
I read that stat and, I've heard stats and I wasn't able to find it, but like 1 in 4 women experience sexual assault of some sort. But really, like, as we're about to talk about, defining sexual assault itself can be difficult in many ways. So I think it's all that to say it's way more common than any of these stats say it is.
Yeah. Which is extremely alarming. And I also feel like as a woman is validating.
Yeah.
Right. Because I feel like so many women have had experiences that they feel like completely not okay about, but they don't feel like they can claim any sort of power around that because they think, oh, okay, well, that wasn't, quote, that bad, and like that just breaks my heart too, And
I think another element there is this isn't really, it's not a one-time thing in a lifetime, right? Like women can experience this and do experience this, multiple times in different kind of variations of it.
Absolutely. And it's also relevant to bring in like just like regular street harassment too. And how, that can be really fucking scary sometimes.
Yeah,
sometimes it gets really scary. Yeah. And that's something that guaranteed every single woman has experienced.
Totally. A couple other stats that I found kind of important. So that same stat for 1 in 5 women experiencing attempted or completed rape, it's 1 in 38 men. I've read stats before where men who experience sexual assault is like probably 1 in 15 or 20 maybe. Wasn't able to find that either, but it is happening to men as well. So I think that's important.
Yeah, that's so important to bring in, especially because that's something that's not talked about as much. Sexual coercion, sexual assault in men is even more under the table. A huge issue with all of this is that there's so much shame around it, right? Especially with the victim blaming, that with the, the legal system, it's like, what were you wearing? It's actually for people to report this, and we can get into this too in terms of what this looks like legally. For people to report this, first of all, they have to relive their trauma. Second of all, it's just so brutal.
Nearly impossible process.
Nearly impossible process that is also, I'm also curious about your thoughts around the language of victim, because I know survivor is much more empowering. What do you think?
I tend to say survivor. I will say victim as well, but whenever I catch myself about to say it or I'm proactively thinking about it, I do prefer the term survivor. Kind of both are used a lot to describe the similar persona.
Yeah. And I think what's important too, I also prefer survivor because I just find it more empowering for the individual. But I think with all of these conversations, especially the ones that are difficult to have or that are messy or that as we're getting into, we don't have a lot of language around. I always encourage people, don't get so worried about the language. It's more important that we're talking about the concepts and we can finesse the language as well. But it's more important that people feel comfortable and welcome to talk about the concepts, even if they're using language that is maybe, out of date or slightly nuanced in a disempowering way, right? Yo, English major over here, language fucking matters. But what's more important is that we're having these conversations, even if it's messy, even if we don't know what kinds of words to use.
Exactly, because it is such a complicated space in so many ways, and there's just so many aspects to it. And I totally agree that getting caught up on the exact words you're using is not the point of these conversations. It's really dive into the messiness. As long as you can describe, this is what I am trying to describe and the intent behind it. I think that's important, and just being able to have those empathetic, compassionate conversations and really show up and be able to state your opinion and be able to elaborate on it to make sure that people are talking about kind of that same common ground.
Right. And also recognizing that with what Revenance is doing, it's just empowering people to speak and claim and tell their story more. So there's no wrong way to tell your story. What's important is that we are acknowledging that this is a very real, very traumatic experiences. These are very real traumatic experiences that so many people go through and then don't talk about, don't share with anyone, or share with maybe one person, or, whatever it might be. So I would love to hear a little bit about, I have not been able to go to a Revenance event yet, and I'm pissed because Kate was doing them in New Orleans. I know you've done a couple in New York, but I've always been either out of town or living somewhere else. So I've not yet had the pleasure, but could you tell us a little bit about what that looks like? And then I know you're also working on book project too, and there are various media that you're addressing this through.
Definitely. So the events themselves, we really wanted to focus on creating these safe, inclusive, beautiful spaces. So we were really lucky in New Orleans. We partnered with an organization called Femissance, who was bringing together women artists in New Orleans and throughout the South. So they already had these beautiful art gallery pop-ups type events. So we kind of partnered with them to host the events there. And the events were two parts. It was the first, we would, kind of data collection aspect. We had questions posted all around the room on large pieces of paper. Have you or someone never been sexually assaulted? What resources, ranking exercises of resources from most to least helpful and most to least accessible. Seeing interesting trends there, talking to friends and family as being both the most and the least helpful, for example.
Wow.
Other questions being, certain ranking exercises of really, and this is where we start to play with how we're defining and viewing sexual assault, of telling a story in 10 lines. And for each line of it, you're saying how good or bad is this experience? Jack and Jill walk home together. That's good. And then as the story goes on, you realize there's something that happens that changes. And now it's a really negative experience. Mm-hmm. So being able to track that line by line and really understand what's happening here that's causing this experience to become so traumatic. So a lot of questions like that, and it's all done silently. And then we come back together about 20 minutes later, and it's about an hour event. And it leaves about 30 minutes for a group discussion, which, as you might imagine, starts out super slow and quiet. And Carlisle and I will usually kind of wander the room and notice things on the posters that we'll call out. I think that example of, friends and family, sharing with friends and family can be both, really helpful, but also really harmful. Because that's so dependent on your own experience and relationships.
Yeah.
So that was, one of the first things that one of the attendees called out was, this is really interesting. And I hadn't really thought about it that way. I always viewed it as something really positive. And every single time the group discussion has gone over by like 15 to 30 minutes, which is,
of course, get the ball rolling. It's going to roll.
And it just like so proved that, people want to have these conversations and they have a lot to say. There's currently not really an easy way to do that, unless you're really starting them yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, that sounds so amazing. I think we're going to need to do one in Seattle, or I'm going to come to New York and we need to do one and combine it with the pillow talk. I think that is an inevitability. So I'm curious to, like, as you're talking, I'm thinking about like, okay, the only thing of that nature that I've been to or really know of is Take Back the Night. Have you ever gone to Take Back the Night?
I think I went to one in school at Tulane.
Yeah, I went to one at Tulane too. So FYI, Kate and I both went to Tulane, but we did not know each other in college. We met afterwards and we were the same year too. So that's kind of funny. But yeah, I guess we were probably both at the same one. Was it in the lawn at Loyola?
I think so.
Yeah, I was there. That's so funny. We were like ships in the night. I wonder if we ever saw each other. I don't remember it.
I don't remember it either.
I never recognized you when I met you. So that's very funny. So Take Back the Night, I just thought of it as you were talking. I'd love to do a little more research around it because I'm just speaking from like distant memory on this. But my memory is that it's basically a march to bring like visibility and awareness to sexual assault and sexual assault survivors. And there were, at the one I went to, there were a handful of speeches that were like, woof, really emotional. And that was the first and honestly only thing I've been to of that nature. That was kind of public, right? Which was part of what was so strong about it. But I can only imagine that having an event like Revenants where it's a more intimate space and it's more interactive dialogue is super powerful.
Yeah, I think what I really love about it is it gives that space for the narrative and for people to kind of participate, challenge perceptions, and really kind of like learn together.
Yeah.
It also allows you to kind of be more concrete about what we can do next. I think that was also kind of what helped us build it was, the Me Too and Time's Up movement are so, so important to get that visibility and to get people talking about it.
Yeah.
But I kept kind of asking myself, like, what's next? We're all sharing these stories. We're all like starting these conversations. What's the next action that we can take from this?
Yeah.
So that was the focus for Rev as well, of like, how can we better collect some of these stories and data points around it to take action in some way, whether that's recommendations for the legal system, how we're defining things, but what can we use that will make this better in our society going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's so essential to, bringing these really difficult things to light. And I think like Me Too and Time's Up movement, that was really surprising and enlightening to a certain contingent of the population and just blatantly obvious and time's up. Like, yeah, it's about fucking time we were talking about this in a public way for a lot of the population too. Obviously recognizing that for the part of the population that, the population, for the part of the population who was like, whoa, I had no idea that was going on, right? There's obviously a certain process of coming to, like maybe even initial denial, and which I think we've seen in spades, especially around sexual assault, right? Allowing that part of the population who just like straight up didn't know about these things or wasn't very aware because they're not talked about. In fact, they're very much suppressed, allowing them to have their process of realization around that. And then also in coaching too, right? Like this is a moment I see in coaching all the time. The moment you have a realization that you have not been seeing something, right? And there's this really beautiful moment that happens there where there's a huge shift in paradigm. And in that moment, there's enormous opportunity for shame to flood in. Personal beratement, shame around, I can't believe I didn't see that before. Embarrassment of, I can't believe I was operating in the world not knowing that thing. Right. And I love that moment in coaching because that's such the critical moment where it's like, okay, instead of opening the floodgates for shame and embarrassment and all of these things that are going to keep you stuck there, how can we, number one, celebrate the new knowing, be like, amazing. Now you know that thing. What are all the possible action steps that you can take in this new direction? How can you use that, alchemize that into something else? So I think it's so essential to be having these conversations about what instead, what next, what can we channel this energy towards? Rather than because if we're not having that conversation, it's very easy to fester in shame. Which really keeps us stuck, right? Because that's personal beratement. It keeps us stuck. So I love that you said that. And I'd love to hear some of the more interesting definitions of sexual assault you've heard. Let's chat a little bit about what even is sexual assault. And this is part of why it's hard to talk about because it is very, very narrowly defined.
I'll tell a quick story that I know I've told you before. And this was a moment that happened a couple of years ago that really this is when I took Revenants and shifted it a bit to focus a lot of the questions around words and definitions. I got a text on a random Friday morning from this guy who I randomly made out with one time and knew for like a year or two, but hadn't talked to in months. And he was just like downtown Manhattan at his friend's apartment. So I made an assumption that it was probably a brunch thing. Mm-hmm. So I was like, yeah, I'll stop by. And it turned out to be the end of this Coke-infused orgy. With these two people and one woman, he was half naked. There's a woman there entirely naked, just striking up a normal conversation with me. And I was like, wow, this is not at all what I expected. And I think I stayed there for about 3 minutes.
Right. A little heads up might have been,
exactly.
Been a little ask, hey, here's what's going on. Do you want to participate?
Exactly. And that's what I started obsessing over after of what in this, I knew it wasn't sexual assault, but I also knew it was a really weird situation.
Yeah.
So that's really when I started.
It crossed the line for you. Yeah. It crossed the line for you because you went into a situation not knowing what it was going to be. That wasn't a conscientious choice necessarily, right?
Yeah.
Because you weren't given the information.
Sexual tension.
Yeah.
And it was just wild.
A little hey, Kate, it's 10 a.m. Want to come join me at this Coke-infused orgy? Might have been nice. To which you could have said, thank you very much for the invitation. I think I'm going to keep reading my book and solving deep problems. Or you might have said yes, right? And that's totally cool as well. But it's giving you the choice with the information.
Exactly. Yeah. Let the person make their own decision based on the facts of the situation.
Yes.
So that was a fun anecdote of how I started getting super passionate about this thing.
I remember when that happened. I remember the text you were like, wow, what the fuck?
But something that was interesting is then I started talking with more friends like you and others and basically saying hey, can I psychoanalyze some of your experiences? And then would sit down and just chat through different experiences. And it was really interesting, one, how common so many women in my network have these quote unquote weird experiences, not something that we're labeling as sexual assault.
Something that crosses the line internally in terms of consent, choice, awareness, and consciously opting in, right? And I think it's important too to bring in, you and I are both very sex positive people, super pro people having sex by choice, right?
Consenting adults.
Consenting adults, exactly.
That's it. So I think I have a dictionary definition of sexual assault that I think is just still leaves so much up to confusion. But it says illegal sexual contact that usually involves force upon a person without consent or is inflicted upon a person who is incapable of giving consent as because of age or physical or mental incapacity.
Yeah.
Or who places the person who causes it, such as a doctor, in a position of trust or authority.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of dynamics there. And I do think some of them are good of the power dynamics, consent, age, etc. But even if you look at today's legal system, consent is not considered as a yes or no. The Chanel Miller story, Know My Name, that book is a really good read on understanding her whole journey. And for those who might not be familiar, that's like the Brock Turner Stanford swimmer case. She wrote an incredible book on it. And they argued her point of consent, even though she was passed out on a pile of garbage. They still questioned whether maybe she had consented at another time. And just that fact of like them even thinking that that could be consent is absurd. That's like a whole other thing. But like just to really highlight, even if we had a firm definition today, which we don't, it's not being used in the legal system in the right way.
I'm crying. That really got me. That's so fucked up. That is so fucked up. It really upsets me.
I'll give one other anecdote from that, and I'll mess up the terminology, but as part of the legal proceedings around it, the police contacted her about her opinion of how they should punish him. And, you know, the phone call caught her off guard, and she and her lawyer hadn't prepared for it. But her lawyer was like, yeah, just like go for it. So she didn't realize the impact that this conversation would have. And something she said was like, yeah, like, you know, it was something around the word prison. And again, I'm going to mess these two up, but essentially like what came out of this is the police officer was like, well, like she said, she doesn't want him to go to prison, which is like the more extreme punishment. So we'll just send him to jail for 30 days or like whatever the final punishment was, which I think it was longer than 30 days. But just like she had no idea that one conversation and one misuse of a word would entirely change the punishment of this man.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that this is a really relevant part of the conversation to bring into people not believing survivors. Also recognizing that when people experience trauma, we block certain things out of our memory, right? Because it's fucking traumatic. Yeah. So I think it's so complex and it's so deeply enraging how much that gets questioned, or like, you know, there's also a lot of fear around people weaponizing their story or people just making shit up. That might happen occasionally, right? But it's very, 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 very uncommon, especially because the legal process of bringing a sexual assault case to light is so fucking dehumanizing that like, why the fuck would someone do that? First of all. Second of all, in that very small contingency, wielding that narrative, what about all the fucking times that, you know, no one ever believes the person who it happened to, right? Ugh. This shit just pisses me off so much. It pisses me off so much, especially because so many people that I care about have been through so much shit. It just pisses me off so much that there's this narrative of not believing people.
We just need to believe women, believe survivors.
And acknowledging the amount of courage that it takes to even speak about that to one person, let alone publicly. Why the fuck would someone put themselves through that if it wasn't true?
And one of the most frustrating things to me about it all is, you know, people will be like, oh, well, like, she can't remember it, or like, why is her story changing, you know, X, Y, Z. But there is so much science behind how trauma impacts our mind and bodies. 2 great books, The Body Keeps Score and The Deepest Well. I learned more from those 2 books than I've ever known about truly how trauma does change our bodies and how it works, including repressing memories in certain situations. So it's just, that argument is just not valid anymore. There's no world in which I'm listening to anyone finishing a sentence that starts it with like, well, I don't really believe that science.
Or what was she wearing? Or why was she there? Or what was she doing alone there? Or blah, blah, blah. Or all these victim blaming narratives. It's
I know. It's like, why aren't we flipping that? Why are we staring so much at her and not at him? Has he done this before?
Yeah.
What was he doing? We just ask so many questions about the survivor and not the one who abuses, assaults, or rapes in that situation.
Absolutely. Let's go back to definition as a segue into also defining consent and understanding from a slightly more uplifting place. Like, what is consent and what's a fuck yeah?
In Revenants, we have done a few exercises where we do ask people to define sexual assault. And it's always really interesting because people really struggle with it. That's where I saw the people spending the most time kind of sitting with a question and trying to figure out what they want to say. Before I read any of these, do you want to give your own definition of sexual assault?
I'll try. I mean, I think the word assault inherently implies forceful violence, which is part of why even the term sexual assault does not encompass the breadth of what we are talking about here. If we're talking like sexual assault, recognizing that that word kind of infers violent physical transgression, I guess I would define it as an interaction of a sexual nature that crosses a line of consent. Then we have to define consent and how extremely nuanced consent is and all of the different flavors and shades of consent and how that can be given. I was careful there to say an interaction of a sexual nature because we want to recognize that groping and sexual harassment and touch or even, masturbating in front of someone or like whatever, like these are sexual interactions, and there's so many more sexual interactions than just sexual intercourse.
Totally. So some of these read unwanted or non-consensual sexual advances.
Mm-hmm.
Any physical, emotional, or mutual interaction that is both unwanted and violates the safety and security of the person on the receiving end of that interaction.
Mm-hmm.
That violation is defined by the recipient, never the instigator. An act involving someone's body in which their participation is predominantly the result of coercion or lack of consent or force. Unwelcome attention or touch, aggressive flirting, pressured sexual conversation. And the last one, a conscious violation of someone's sexual boundaries.
I think the last one really captures it, except for that because this is talked about so nearly not enough. I think sometimes it is unconscious violation because we just don't know where the boundaries are because we're not talking about it enough. So I really want to bring in here because I work, as you know, as anyone listening knows, I work closely with men, helping them build relational and dating skills. And this is something that comes up so much in my work with men is just like, this fear of like, I want to be proactive in my love life. I want to be bold and like get a little cheeky and make strong moves and advances. And I don't want to cross the line, but I don't even know where the fuck the line is. So I'm just going to opt to like not do anything. So I think this is so important to talk about because, and what I say with my guys too, is when we have these kinds of conversations is two main things. Number one, the line is respect. It does not feel safe or okay to have someone be making a flirtatious or sexual advancement that feels degrading or disrespectful or where there's not an established foundation of respect. And the second being, how much is this person allowing space for me to opt in, reciprocate, or signal how I want to participate or not participate, what's okay to me and what's not okay to me. And I guess the third, I would add a third, do I feel safe to set boundaries with this person without them fucking exploding? Because I think that's a huge fear that a lot of women have. I mean, we've all had an experience, we've all had shitty experiences around this. I think that's something that I would want more men to be aware of is that it can feel scary to say no to someone, especially if there's no one around, because sometimes they go off on you. So that's a huge part of it too. And I think what's also frustrating for a lot of guys, and especially I think because I talk to so many guys about this too, it really sucks for everyone, especially because like what I always want to communicate to my guys too is that there may be times when a woman has had so many back-to-back annoying fucking interactions that she assumes that in you when that is not your intent. And it's so important to not take that personally and to recognize that that is a byproduct of someone experiencing, I describe it in a way of like, if you're going through your day and like 3 people spill coffee on you in the row and like the first couple times you're going to be like, I guess I'll just change my shirt. I'll just dry it on the hand dryer, like blah, blah. And then like the 4th person does it and you're just like, fuck off, and like, you're just like, damn, I just spilled, right? I have also heard a lot of guys frustrated where they will maybe ask a woman for her number. And this is also part of why I always recommend guys giving their number instead of asking for the number, because it allows them, it's just so much more breezy and it allows so much more space for opt-in and conscientious opt-in. It also makes it so you're not going out with someone who's not actually into you and it's just going along with it. A frustration I hear from men is like, I asked for her number and then like I texted her and she didn't respond. And it's like, why would she even give me her number if she wasn't planning on responding? Because she didn't feel comfortable saying no because she was afraid. That's why.
Yeah. I think that's something that, and I know you talk about this a lot with your guys, but women are always thinking about safety.
It's like you're not even aware. You don't even know that it's happening some of the time, but you're like, oh, turn in the street, scanning. Cool. That person looks, I don't want to cross that. I'm going to cross the street. Oh, cool. I'm going to round the block. It's constant.
We're always taking steps to make sure that we're staying safe.
Yeah.
So I think that's just really important for men to consider and just be aware of. We are always in that mode of like, making sure that we are safe and that our friends are safe and whoever we're out with.
That's in terms of like women traveling in packs, especially going out or going to the bathroom or whatever. There's a reason for that. And like earlier this year, I went to a concert with a few friends and one of my friends got straight up roofied at the venue. She collapsed. We had to then get her into a lift. We had to drag her into a lift to try to get her home. We had no idea what had happened. We're just like, whoa, she got drunk really quickly. We didn't really realize what had happened until later. And when we kind of checked all the stuff, she then, started to throw up in the lift because she had been fucking roofied. And the lift, we were in a kind of sketchy, vacant area of the city. And the lift driver kicked us out on the curb and left us and yelled at us. It was awful. And I was with one other girl we were sober. We did not know what to do. We ended up calling 911 because honestly, there was a point where like I was trying to keep her awake and there was a point where I thought she was going to die. This shit fucking happens. This shit is not a joke. That was deeply traumatic for me. Right. And not to mention for her. Right. But that was deeply traumatic for me. That was really fucking scary. I think all of this is to say, and I'm an optimist and I am I love to see the best in people and the best in life, but like, it is just so, so deeply important that we take this seriously. And I will say too, like as a woman, I've traveled extensively all over the world by myself. I managed to be okay, but I had some times when I got lucky, I felt comfortable doing that because I have really good street smarts because I can read people really well. And I can also adapt to social scripts very easily. That's a really dangerous thing to do. So I just think it's so important that men understand that this is something that is part of the reality of being in a female body, right? I also have had a lot of questionable experiences also while traveling, right? That would classify as sexual assault. It's so fucking important. And it's so fucking important that we can talk about, and also that we can talk about this with men. I think it's challenging for men to talk about this sometimes because they can feel blamed. It's really important to include men in this conversation from a place of you haven't had this experience. So you're not going to be as hyper aware of this, right? Because it isn't your lived experience. And you have a fucking responsibility to understand this, right? And to help move this narrative forward in a more constructive way.
I think on that note, a couple notes as I was kind of thinking about what we wanted to say here. I think one, and this is just something I've been doing in life more in general, but I'm like really over assumptions and, assumptions that people are making of me, assumptions I'm making of others. I'm really like checking myself in a much more serious way to just ask questions when I find myself doing that.
Yeah.
And would probably say the same for guys, especially in dating. I think what you're just describing of men like that self-doubt or uncertain, like kind of feeling blame, etc. Obviously, this probably wouldn't happen with someone you're just meeting. But if there's this like weird interaction or, something happens with somebody that you're dating or a partner, ask them about it and start that dialogue rather than making assumptions, because then both parties are probably going to make their own assumptions and it just leads to worse and worse communication.
Yeah, absolutely. And like, if you're not sure if something's okay, you can ask. You can ask.
Consent.
Exactly. So let's define consent. What is consent?
Consent is a verbal affirmation that you want to engage in either sexual activity or specific sexual activities. That's how I would define it.
I love that. I saw a really great graphic of consent where it's compared to like asking someone if they want a cup of tea. It's like, hey, do you want a cup of tea? And then it's like, if someone says, yeah, and then later they're like, oh, actually, I don't want a cup of tea. You don't like force feed them the cup of tea, right? Or if you're like, hey, want a cup of tea? And they're like, not right now, maybe later. It's like, you don't fucking force feed them a cup of tea.
Yeah, they don't want the tea.
Yeah, they don't want, if they don't want tea, you don't feed them the tea. You don't be like, what the fuck? I just started making this cup of tea. I think that's a really good way to put it, is like, if someone doesn't want tea, they're allowed to change their mind. They're allowed to stop drinking the cup of tea halfway through the cup of tea. They're allowed to say they want a cup of tea and then be like, oh, I actually don't want a cup of tea. They are allowed to enthusiastically want the cup of tea. They are allowed to ask for another cup of tea.
I was very specific to say verbal in that, because there's also like the physical cues of consent. Yeah. And honestly, the more I think about this, if two people about to have sex if one person cannot directly say, yes, I want to have sex.
Yeah.
Then there's probably something they don't want to have sex. If they can't actually say it and have a conversation about it, they either don't want to, or they're probably not ready for it because they can't hold a conversation about it.
Exactly. And this is why it's also so important for us to dissolve the shame around talking about sex in the first place. This is part of why it's so hard to talk about sexual assault and like transgressions, is because we're uncomfortable talking about sex. Let's talk about it. Also, like, it's so much better when you talk about it, when you can talk about it. Oh, Jesus.
Otherwise, you're back to assumptions. You're back to like people being heads about it. It's like, just fucking talk about it.
Yeah. And, I've heard a lot of women say, oh, I don't want someone to ask me. I don't want someone, like, it's not sexy to me if someone, is blah, blah, blah. And like, I can appreciate, it's attractive when someone makes a bold move confidently and allows the space for me to reciprocate and opt in, right? But I just think I would urge women not to continue that narrative. I think it makes things very confusing for men. It also is the most tried and true way to get consent is verbally. I don't know. Did you watch Normal People yet?
Not yet.
Oh my God. It's, first of all, have you read the book?
I haven't read it either.
But have you, both of her books, Sally Rooney is just like so fucking amazing. She's a young Irish novelist, and Hulu recently made a show based on one of her books, Normal People. And the consent and first of all, the sex scenes are just, the internet is freaking the fuck out. They're so hot. Second of all, the consent, the way that consent is portrayed between Connell and Marianne, the leads, is so good. It's such a good example. And I'm just so happy something like that is being put on TV, because also just like TV has such power to communicate and to, represent narratives and shift culture. It's really heartening to see how this is starting to be represented more. And I think there's a scene where Connell is like, hey, you let me know if you want to stop, do you want to do this? And she's like, yeah. And he's like, okay, great. You let me know if you want to stop at any point. It's not going to be weird. Let me know. Right. And then they have very rousing sex. Don't even get me started on the sex scenes in Normal. Yeah. So anyway, that I just like, that's really heartening to me. And like, that's such a good example. And I think like wherever we can point out, it's that moment of shame again too, right? And especially for men, it's like, don't do that. Don't do that. It's like, we need to be having conversations about like, do this.
Yeah.
Do this.
Kind of like thinking a bit more about that narrative of like, oh, I love when men are like, aggressive and come up to me and like, don't ask for consent. But I think, when you are dating someone, there is a lot more room to play. And like, you could do something like that. You're both going to be consenting to it, as in like you're in a relationship. You're like, hey, let's do this thing.
Totally.
Like, come up to me in a bar and like pretend you don't know me. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's something
Absolutely.
They engage in that.
And I think it's really important to acknowledge too, and maybe I'll get someone on my podcast to talk about this too. The kink community is one of the most sex party scene is one of the most consensual places ever, right? It's not just a fucking free for all. It is like, there is very clear lines around safety with that. Also, like, bold moves are fucking fantastic. So long as and it's only truly bold when we're allowing someone, we're like, bold, like, do the move, leave the space. Right? It's all about allowing the space for the other person to let you know, to opt in, to signal to you how they want to interact with what you've just said, right?
Exactly.
Let's talk a little bit, and we're going to start to wrap up shortly. This has been such a good conversation. I think it's so important. I also want to acknowledge that because this is a messy thing to talk about, I very well may have said something that was mildly questionable in this conversation. I want to own that. And I want to like hold myself to that and like continue to talk about it. Let's talk a little bit about some tips and best practices for dating and being in romantic relationships as someone who has experienced sexual assault. And then the reverse of that, which is being or dating someone, having sex with someone who has experienced that. What are some best practices for like acknowledging, respecting that trauma and holding space for that in a way that can help someone feel really safe?
So I think I'll start with, we talked a bit about data before. I can't remember if I said this, but I think it was something like 98% of Revenance attendees either have been sexually assaulted or know someone that's been sexually assaulted.
Yeah.
So if you haven't already, there is such a high chance that you're going to date someone who has experienced sexual assault, and maybe you've experienced it yourself as well. But I think it's really common that people are in that dynamic, but maybe they're not always communicating about it. So I think for people who have experienced sexual assault, I think one, the most important thing to do is to start that reflection and healing process to make sure that for yourself on your own as like an individual human being, whether it's therapy, which I think is another thing that's like has a stigma around, but is one of the best things we could ever do for ourselves.
Absolutely. And I just want to interject quickly there too with owning that is something you've experienced, because there is a stigma around. Like that doesn't mean you're taking on a stigma. That means you're taking your power back by being like, yo, this is something I've experienced.
Yeah. And remember, it's not like one story that defines you. It's an experience. And some people have multiple experiences. And it's a thing that happens in some of our lives that therapy is really helpful to work through.
Yeah.
But I do truly think that like that self-work, whether it's therapy, writing, exercise, meditating, a combination of things is very important for someone. You can be in relationships without doing that work, but I think as a human being, you'll be a lot more evolved and in a better place to work through some of that first.
Yeah.
And, I think another important aspect is understanding what your trauma triggers in certain behaviors or patterns, so that when you do start dating and you're in a relationship, you're able to communicate with your partner, like, one, wait until you're ready and you want to share, but then share with your partner, like, this, I've experienced sexual assault. You can tell them as much or little detail as you want to. Remember, this is your narrative and your experience. But I think it's super important to share that so your partner knows, and also to say, like, this is how it impacts me today. These are like certain things in bed that will trigger me, or like certain word choices that, I am really triggered by and I don't fully understand why. And I think a lot of the time with these behaviors and triggers, we have no idea why we're doing it, but it's
absolutely. And I think that's so essential, both for someone who is in a relationship, a sexual relationship with a survivor, or someone who is a survivor, is the onus is not on the survivor to understand the exact nature of trauma. Right? Just for all of us to be compassionate with anyone who's experienced that like sometimes they may feel super sexually empowered and something's not triggering at all. Right. And like another day is like something might trigger. And we need to look at trauma in that way too, is like, it's not a fucking cookie cutter, predictable experience in terms of like how that moves through us and how we experience it.
Yeah. I think all that to say, do the self-work. It's worth it.
It's worth it. And it's like, you're worth it. You're doing it for yourself. Any kind of self-work or therapy or whatever, like that is you investing and showing up in yourself. It's an act of self-love.
Totally. Yeah. And my hope is that, when you share it with your partner, and we'll talk about, being on the receiving end of this in a second, but that it's met with compassion and empathy and, love more than anything else. And if it's not, I've had my own experiences. I've shared some of those with friends, and I've lost friends in the past because they are making their own judgments or, don't see things as a big deal. Yeah. And we could try to educate them to certain extents, but also like if you're with a partner and they're reacting in a really negative way to that, you need to protect yourself and make sure that you're in a healthy situation.
Absolutely. And I think also with emotions, whether it's a history of sexual assault, sexual trauma, whether it's emotional trauma around something else, like whether it is just like something deeply impacted you, your feelings around something are valid, whether or not other people understand them. It is not up to anyone else to tell you, hey, that wasn't a big deal. Or like, hell, that doesn't sound that bad. It's like, if it matters to you, it fucking matters to you. And people who care about you need to respect that. And if they can't respect that, they're not someone who is holding you as the precious, adorable little thing that we all are.
Right.
Not cool. Not cool. Yeah. And I mean, that's really painful to go through, to lose people in your life. But ultimately, that's also an act of self-love, because you're like, hey,
True.
I need to have people in my life who I can rely on, who take my experience seriously and who believe me and who are not trying to control my narrative or diminish my narrative.
Totally. Especially important in a partnership. You need to have a partner who can understand and be able to react to those certain behaviors and patterns in a healthy way that you two can talk about and have a dialogue around. And the most important thing is you feel safe in the relationship, both people feeling safe in the relationship, and your trauma and your experiences, need to also have that feeling of safety around it with this person.
Yeah, absolutely. So what can someone do if they are dating or having sex with, or a friend to someone who has experienced sexual trauma? I think it's also important to recognize that for all of the reasons we've discussed and more, you might intuit that someone has experienced something and they have not verbally told you. So that's something to be aware of too. And that it's everyone's prerogative to talk about this as much, as little, and in the manner that they want to. So I think this is just something good to be conscientious of, whether or not someone has verbally told you about it. And, what can people do?
Yeah.
Or what is the most supportive way to be in relationship with someone who has experienced this, or who you are intuiting may have experienced something?
If someone hasn't shared anything directly yet, I don't think it's appropriate to directly ask them if they've been assaulted. One, that's also like you making assumptions again.
Yeah.
But if you think someone's acting off, or you notice behaviors, you could ask like, hey, I've noticed, you're doing X, Y, and Z.
Yeah.
Can you share why? Or, asking open-ended
What's going on? Yeah. And that's a great way to communicate in general. It's like, I'm noticing X, Y, and Z. What's going on?
Like, what's going on? Do you want to talk about it? And that's it. And don't make assumptions about, what this person has gone through, because it could be something really different.
Yeah.
Also, there's a ton of different ways that people get trauma, which is a whole other talk track. But like, trauma can appear in so many different ways in our lives.
Yeah.
But in terms of reacting, so if your partner does share, or friend or family member, I think the first and foremost, you say thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
Anytime that someone shares trauma, it's like you need to validate, one, like, thank you for trusting me and telling me this. And it's validating their experience. And then it's kind of navigating this road of, letting them tell you as much as they want. You can ask them some open-ended questions, ask if they want to share more. I think as a partner, it is really important, whether in that first conversation, or you can always say you can talk about it later, but how can I best support you? What are some of those triggers or patterns that, you want me to be aware of? And then it's
maybe having a word that they can let you know, like a safe word of some sort, of like, they can let you know if they're feeling triggered, so you can take that seriously.
Exactly.
And they can feel safe in that. Yeah.
But it's truly all communication. It's listening to them, and then actually taking action on what they're saying. She says, I am triggered when you call me, baby, and I hate this thing in bed. Then you need to make a mental note of that. And even if you slip up in either of those situations, it's like, you need to immediately recognize that and say, like, you know what, I completely this slipped my mind. I'm so sorry.
And also make sure someone knows that they can feel comfortable letting you know, hey, that thing happened again. Right? Hey, this thing is happening. Remember? Right? Because we also want to acknowledge that, like, we're human, and sometimes it takes us a little bit to learn something.
Yeah, totally.
So it's communications from both ends. Yeah.
Communications from both ends. And I think being able to listen, showing that person compassion, it's always a work in progress. To your point, none of us are perfect. We're all going to make mistakes along the way.
Yeah.
But it's being able to reflect on that and talk about it, and talk about how you'd want to do it better in the future.
Mm-hmm. Have you watched Big Little Lies?
Yes.
Yes. So second season, Shailene Woodley's character, another great representation of in the media of the subject matter being addressed in a really intelligent, careful, caring way. Second season, Shailene Woodley's character, she is, was violently raped in the past, and you see her starting to date again, and you see really, really fucking healthy example of what it can look like to, really give someone space and grace to be intimate with a history of trauma.
Their encounters were really well done.
So well done.
Really exemplify like how you should kind of treat situations like that.
Awesome. Wonderful. So I think this conversation was so great and so important. Thank you so much. Yes. While you have a captive audience, what are a few things you wish more people knew? Or like, if you had a billboard, what are a few messages you would communicate to the people?
This is super common. Corey and I have both commented on that frequently, not just for one person to have one story, but for one person to have multiple stories. And being able to understand how common it is and have that empathy, even if you haven't experienced it yourself.
And having empathy with yourself if you have experienced it, right? It's not a personal deficit. It's unfortunately, and we like conversations like this and Revenants and Take Back the Night and more, and, constructive representations in the media of consent and like dating with the history. All of this is moving the needle forward in terms of this happening less and us not having to say, yo, this is really fucking common.
Totally. And I think leads to the next point of like, we have to start talking about it. I think we've also mentioned a lot of different ways to kind of have these conversations. And I know that probably the main question is like, where do we start? It's like with your friends and with the people that you love around you. Of like, I think there's a few things there. One of, just opening up a dialogue of stories in the media, books or articles that you can read about these topics, and sharing that knowledge with people in your friend group, doing exercises of like reflecting on your own behaviors and seeing like, are there better ways that we can approach certain situations or date or, being able to navigate conversations like this. But it's the more that we like stay on our own in our own heads about this, like that's not going to get us anywhere. We really have to start talking about this with other people.
Exactly.
And also that's going to help to hold other people accountable. If something I like to ask guy friends of mine, and it's always a very awkward encounter. And like, do you have any friends who have like assaulted someone? And I think it's awkward because, one, they never really know. I don't think anyone has ever been like, I know like one specific person, because it's probably not talked about regularly as a topic. But I think starting that conversation is going to really help, one, just like place you as more of an advocate and more of this person of like, this behavior is not okay. Like, what can we do to, we all be better? Mm-hmm. And maybe for people that do have more negative, maybe they have assaulted people or like are viewing this in a different way, it's pulling them into the dialogue, and it's having them to understand other perceptions from people that they love and that they're close to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And I say this a lot with my clients and just like in general, because I just want more people to know this life hack that, as Brene Brown says, secrecy breeds shame. So the way to dissolve shame is by openly talking about things, telling at least one person, right? So if you want to start with your mom, if you want to start with your closer friends, great, start somewhere. And start having these conversations.
Totally. And then I'll add, I guess for anyone interested in Revenants and that work, we talked a lot about some of the Revenants events. We're still doing those. We've also pivoted to do a lot more writing as well. So revenants.co, REVENANCE.co. You can sign up for our newsletter. That also should link to our Medium account. I'm also working on writing a book, which is
you are. Yes, she is. I'm so excited. Kate is a great writer.
It's a like hybrid of kind of a short story and poetry, evaluating or like kind of surfacing situations inspired by my own experiences, the experiences of people that I love, and written in a way that's really meant to cause people to look at their own interactions, whether on either side of that table, and maybe question some of their past behaviors or what has happened to them. Mm-hmm. And really to see parts of their own experiences in this writing. And can be pretty dark and difficult to read, but we are currently working on making this really like artistic and beautiful small book of it, so that it's just like, these dark dense type stories written in a very concise manner, but with this like beautiful art to show that like these are really difficult experiences, but we're all evolving.
And recognizing how therapeutic putting that into a narrative and putting it out into the world, even if it's anonymously, can be for not only yourself, but other people who resonate with that. So if anyone has a story that they want to share anonymously or otherwise, can they do that with Revenants?
Yeah, we're working on kind of building out the types of stories that we're publishing. So I would say you can go to my website, which links to all of my social media, etc. And feel free to like DM me on Instagram, or I think I have a contact form on the site, katemcdermott.com.
How do we spell MacDermott? Because as someone who has misspelled it many a time.
KATEMACDERMOTT.com.
Awesome. Great. And I will link this all in the show notes as well.
But yeah, feel free to reach out wherever. We're chatting with a couple more people now to like add more perceptions to the Revenants writing group. So we're definitely trying to make it a space for, multiple people to come to, whether to read or to contribute their own writing. And, it's a process for us all to process, heal, and learn.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I hope everyone got a lot out of this, and let's keep the conversation going.
Keep the conversation going.
That is a wrap. So I'm just going to read off some stats highlighting how disproportionately Black women are impacted by sexual violence. And this is from a Instagram post that Kate wrote. The post is longer, but I will just share some stats. 22% of Black women will be raped in their lifetime at least once. 40% of Black women will experience domestic violence in their lifetime. 53% of Black trans women experience sexual violence. That's more than half. 56% of Black trans women experience domestic violence. Again, more than half. Black women are 3 times as likely to die from domestic violence than white women. It's one of their leading causes of death. 11.2% of high school Black girls have been raped. Girls, not adults. A Black woman is 3 to 4 times more likely to die in childbirth than a white woman. So I think that's important to share and to acknowledge. This isn't going to start shifting until we can really come from a place of acknowledging the reality. So let's keep talking about this. I hope today's episode helped provide some context and some tools for looking within and also navigating these conversations out in the world with other people. I will see y'all next week, and happy integrating.